General Motors began its downsizing in 1977 with the hugely successful downsized full-size vehicles like the Chevy Impala and Caprice, the Pontiac Catalina, Bonneville, the Oldsmobile 88 and 98, the Buick Electra, as well as the LeSabre, and the Cadillac DeVille and Fleetwood. Again, these cars were a overall very successful achievement for General Motors as the sales kept at the previous levels and in some cases even increased. And buyers liked the fact that these new vehicles had about the same amount of room on the inside, but the exterior packaging was much more tidy, so you could fit into parking spaces in cities or garages. And in any event, the overall public perception of these vehicles was that they were good replacements for the previous generation full-size cars. As 1978 came around, it was time for General Motors to replace its intermediate lineup because the newly downsized full-size cars were encroaching on the footprint of what was formerly the intermediate. So obviously you got to shrink the intermediates if you shrink the full-size cars. And that happened in 1978 for General Motors. So cars like the Pontiac Grand Prix, the Buick Regal, the Oldsmobile Cutlass, those are vehicles that now were shrunk versus the prior version. And the wheelbase on these new intermediates shrunk considerably in some cases. Let's just take the example of the Olds Cutlass. The 1977 generation, it depended upon whether or not you bought the two-door or the four-door, as both had different wheelbases. The two-door rode atop 112-inch wheelbase, the four-door rode atop 116-inch wheelbase. But in 1978, they consolidated these into a single wheelbase length, irrespective of whether or not you bought a four-door or a two-door. And so all of the Cutlasses in 1978, whether that was the Salon sedan or coupe, the Salon Brome coupe or sedan, the Calais, the Supreme, and the Custom Cruiser wagon, all rode atop 108.1-inch wheelbase for 1978. And because the vehicles got smaller, General Motors was able to put smaller displacement engines in the vehicles, and in some cases, they also put, well, let's just say lighter duty transmissions like the not so great turbo-hydromatic 200 transmission, which we've previously discussed. And there were some interesting product planning decisions on these vehicles. As an example, on the Olds and Buick lineup, they had this pseudo hatchback style. These were not hatchback cars, but they looked like hatchbacks. For whatever reason, the other divisions didn't follow suit on their intermediates. Pontiac didn't have a hatchback like this, nor did Chevrolet, but Olds and Buick, for whatever reason, thought that this was the better plan. And so there were some strange things. Of course, after just a few years, Olds and Buick would revise the roofline on those vehicles to more closely resemble the 1976 to 79 Cadillac Seville in its success. But these cars also have a very strange feature, and I think one of the worst examples of General Motors' cost-cutting initiatives. And that is that on the four-door cars, the rear window glass is fixed. Yes, I said that correctly. You cannot roll the rear window down in these vehicles. It's just fixed. It's stationary. Notice on this particular car, there is a switch for the windows to activate, but that does not move the main plane of glass in the door. On this particular vehicle, that is just enabling the vent pane to open behind the door. That was able to be swung out, and it was optional that it was power equipment. But the actual pane of glass in the door itself was immovable. Now, why in the world would General Motors do this? Well, remember, these cars were downsized, and one of the things that General Motors was trying to achieve was an improvement in fuel economy standards, because they knew at this point that corporate average fuel economy standards, or CAFE regulations, were forcing them to achieve 27.5 miles per gallon fleet average by the mid to late 1980s. And as a result, cars had to get smaller, they had to have smaller engines, and they had to lose weight, basically, so that those smaller engines could push them around. And that's one of the great things when you start cutting weight out of vehicles. It really is this virtuous circle. So if you're able to take weight out of various areas of the car, then you can, let's say, make the brakes smaller. That saves more weight. You can then save weight on chassis components, again, saving more weight. And then you could put a smaller engine in the car or transmission, because the engine or transmission really has to move a lighter vehicle. So loss of weight in any area really helps cement further weight loss in other areas as you're designing vehicles. So it's an amazing thing, and General Motors was trying to really determine how it could best cut weight out of these vehicles. And I suspect at some point there was a market research study that indicated when drivers and passengers were driving around in their vehicles that they rarely, if there was nobody in the back seat, they didn't put the windows down in the rear, that they only put the front windows down. And on top of that, remember by this point, a lot of cars had air conditioning, so people weren't putting windows down, didn't need as much ventilation as they once did, because air conditioning was becoming a more popular option on cars. So the combination of air conditioning becoming more popular, as well as some market research studies that suggested that individuals don't roll down their windows when they're sitting in the front of the car, coupled with the fact that if you remove the ability for the windows to go down, you can save on all that hardware. You can save on window regulators and on the crank handle itself, or the power window motor, or the places those would attach to the vehicle. So you're saving weight by removing the functionality of that glass going down. So that was another benefit, another significant benefit of this. And I think also you could make the door smaller, because it didn't have to accommodate a power window and the window regulator, so you could also get a bit more room in the rear. And of course, let's not forget that by removing the window regulator and all that related equipment, that you're saving money. And so GM, as it produced hundreds of thousands of these intermediate-sized cars that didn't have that rear window that moved up and down, they saved a lot of money because they didn't have to have that equipment in the vehicle. So it was a win for weight savings, it was a win for cost savings, and maybe it wasn't that huge of a detriment to the consumer, or so GM thought at the time. Now, interestingly, they would make, as I mentioned, those vent panes movable, not only on the pseudo hatchback car that I showed, but also when the car transitioned to a notchback for Olds and Buick, you could have that like rear window glass that's behind the main pane of glass that would rotate in and out. that was the vent window that you got when this transitioned to the notchback, that you could rotate that rearmost pane of glass behind the divider bar in and out, and that could be power operated in some vehicles. So, it's just kind of a humorous story that GM was so, I would say, fixated on not having the main piece of glass go up and down that, well, I think some consumers didn't like it, and they ended up putting in that vent window that rotated to give you a little bit of air if you were sitting in the back seat. So I think that this was one of General Motors' perhaps worst cost savings ideas, because, I don't know, I would like to be able to put all the windows down if I have a four-door car, not just the front windows, and you just couldn't do that on the intermediates. Now, strangely, these intermediate-sized cars actually became great sellers. The Olds Cutlass in particular would soldier on, in coupe form at least, for many years, all the way through to the 1988 model year. And so they sold well, and they kept them in the lineup, and they were still popular even at the end, again, as two-door cars where they didn't have this rear window issue that I'm describing. But it was overall a good platform. They ended up being known as the G-body cars once the front-wheel drive A-body cars were introduced in 1982. And I would say in general they were pretty good. The early model years, as is typical with General Motors vehicles, like 1978, I would say 1978 through 83 aren't nearly as good in terms of quality as the later model years, in part because of the engines and that awful turbohydromatic 200 transmission that eventually would be revised into the 204R, which was a much better and more durable transmission. In fact, that was the transmission that was behind the turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 in the Buick Grand National, and it generally held up just fine if you weren't brake torquing it pretty significantly. So what do you think? What is the worst GM or other cost savings initiative that you can come up with. This is one of the ones that's at the top of my list. I have a few others, and I'll keep you in waiting for some of those. But put a comment in the comment section on what is your least favorite cost savings initiative that you know of from any automaker. Thanks again for watching.